I work alone, except when I work with Ronaldo, which is all the time. Shout out to Homestar Runner. I have no contemporaries here on YouTube. None. There is nobody on YouTube connected to political philosophy, political science, history, let alone veganism in specific, let alone history and politics of China in specific. There's nobody I'd want to collaborate with and make a YouTube video with these days. I do not know anybody of intellectual substance and integrity on this whole channel. And you know what? A kid like Cosmic Skeptic, it's the most tragic sort of YouTube content for me to behold of all, because I know he means well, and I know his audience means well, and what they're doing is bad and dangerous and wrong. And for me, from my perspective, it's also demoralizing, because I've got to look at this and look at the audience and ask, why is nobody in this room capable of thinking through this problem through more than a single stage of analysis? Okay, multiple stages of analysis from multiple angles. Like somebody presents you with a glittering abstraction. You don't think, okay, well, all right, that's interesting. That's a nice abstract idea you've got there. But let's think about that in more than one historical context. Let's think about that with maybe some examples that aren't so flattering to your assumptions in this argument. Just a little bit of lowercase r reasoning to tease out what the problems might be. So this kid, Cosmic Skeptic, made a video. It has more than 100,000 views now, 100,000 uncritical, adulating views, in which he says it's okay, it's even wonderful and positive and good for all of us to behave as if we believe in a principle we know to be untrue if we think it is useful and necessary for the greater happiness of our nation, of our society, of some larger number, some unit of people. And apparently nobody in the audience thinks this through even more than one step. Sit there, completely unanimous applause for this. Nobody stops and thinks, wait a minute. This reminds me of centuries of human history. This reminds me of thousands of years of political debates. Like, there was a time when people thought it had this kind of social utility to make up stories that, if you would fight and die for the emperor, then you would go to heaven after you died. You'd be rewarded in heaven with virgins, right? And there were people, Machiavellian people in positions of power, who knew these things to be untrue. But they propounded them anyway because they thought it's not true, but it's useful and it's necessary for the strength of the government, for the stability, the peacefulness of the society as a whole. It's necessary for that greater happiness of the greater number of people. You know what? It wasn't just Muslim countries that did this. It wasn't just Christian countries. You even see that in the history of Buddhist nations. Buddhist nations where the religion, in theory, in principle, sets down that you shouldn't even kill a mosquito, you shouldn't kill another human being, but they managed to come up with excuses. They managed to reason their way through why it is that if you kill an enemy, if you kill the country next door rather than citizens of your own country, in fact, that's good karma and not bad karma. And don't worry, the Buddhist monks will sit down and explain it to you. The Buddhist monks will even do a ceremony where they bless your saber or your spear before you go into battle and use a sacred relic of the Buddha to tell you that your side's going to win and the other side's going to lose. These deep hypocrisies exist throughout our history. And in terms of social engineering in the pre-modern world, it was all based on this premise. There were people who told terrible lies about sexuality, for example, and they knew that these things were not medically real. In many cases, they knew they weren't in any sense spiritually or religiously true or what have you. They said, well, we have to tell these lies because if we don't, women are going to be getting pregnant with other men's children and so on. We have to tell these lies because if we don't restrict people's, sexual freedom. This was the basis of every authoritarian Machiavellian regime in every country and culture all around the world. But here we have this kid telling us, with just a single stage of analysis, that his defense of the doctrine of human rights is that he knows it to be untrue, but that he wants people to behave as if it were true because he thinks it's useful and necessary for the greater good. This is dragging us back to the Dark Ages in more ways than one. And what's more disturbing to me, even acknowledging that this is a younger man than myself, is the choice to really disregard and lie about the history of the last 100 years. Now, I'm only talking about 100 years for a reason. What we now call human rights is a doctrine that emerged after World War II. If you don't believe me, let me just briefly remind you. There was a similar sounding but profoundly different doctrine during the French Revolution and the American Revolution, not in that order, of the rights of man. No, they sound similar in the English language. The rights of man and human rights, and they're profoundly different. People who participated in the American Revolution and the debates that ensued thereafter and writing the Constitution and so on, people who participated in the French Revolution and in the debates that ensued thereafter under Napoleon's dictatorship, for example, their concept, for example, of human equality in that period, the rights of man period, when they said all men are born equal, to them that only meant nobody is born a king as opposed to a commoner. Nobody is born entitled to wealth because of their name being an aristocrat. What they meant when they said all men are born equal was only and exclusively, for example, that your promotion in the military should not be based on your bloodline and your connection to a noble household. Right? These were major tensions in Europe at that time. They were tensions in North America to a lesser extent. Their concept of human equality under the rights of man had absolutely nothing to do with equal access to education. Completely foreign. That's our concept now, after World War II. Had nothing to do with equal access to drinking water. Had nothing to do with equal access to health care. And of course, most shamefully, the people who wrote the American Constitution, and also, by the way, Napoleon himself and his government friends, they saw no contradiction whatsoever in promoting their rights of man doctrine while promoting a society built on slavery. Yeah, in case you didn't hear, Napoleon fought a war to bring back the slave trade in Haiti. Didn't go very well for him, but nevertheless, Napoleon also wanted to have a slave trading global empire. This is a contrast to him and other voices in the French Revolution period. Okay, that was the rights of man. Human rights, after World War II, remarkably different in all these ways, even though some of the jargon is similar. And of course, some younger people find this puzzling. How was it possible for the authors of the American Constitution to live with these contradictions, or the participants in the French Revolution, so on and so forth? Tell me something, kid. Tell me something, Cosmic Skeptic. How did human rights work out after World War II? Was it a success or a failure? How did the human rights doctrine play out in Korea, in what we call the Korean War or the Korean Civil War, when the United States of America committed atrocities? How did the human rights doctrine work out in China, when more than 30 million people died? 30 million is the minimum estimate in the Great Leap Forward. How did human rights doctrine work out for Cambodia? How did the human rights doctrine work out for apartheid in South Africa after World War II? How did the human rights doctrine work out for Yugoslavia, Kosovo? I'm sorry, the human rights doctrine is a proven failure. And if you're really an insider with political science or political philosophy, you know this, because there was a sort of sequel doctrine called the R2P doctrine, responsibility to protect. There was actually a recognition within elite levels of United Nations and international community to try to set up a new sort of human rights regime that would have some teeth and enforcement. Okay, the human rights doctrine failed and failed and failed from the moment it was first designed and implemented, which I guess you could say was during World War II. And, oh yeah, you know what, a little example you might have heard of, kid? Have you heard about the creation of the State of Israel? How did that work out in terms of human rights doctrine? Okay, was that not a human rights disaster from the day it started down to the present? Nobody has ever been able to square the pragmatic reality Israel and Zionism and settlements and borders. Nothing about Israel has ever fit into the paradigm of international human rights law or human rights doctrine, and the whole world just keeps on trundling ahead. And yeah, if you want to get real atheist about it, take a good long look at the reality of Saudi Arabia in any period of history, including today, and ask yourself what human rights doctrine has done about that in the past and what you think it's likely to do in the future. And I may sound overly cynical here. I'm actually very idealistic, because when I look back at that history, post-World War II, inclusive of Cold War history, I'm aware that there are counterexamples. I actually have a sophisticated view on this, unlike this piece of shit, mentally disabled poser cosmic skeptic. Okay? When you have a sophisticated view of something, you think through more than a single stage of analysis. You think, hey, wait, if this doctrine failed, there must also be counterexamples in the same period of history that will illustrate that failure and will show us the mechanisms whereby we distinguish actually successful political science policy. And there are. I'd encourage you to Google the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was an economic trade mechanism legal principle. How can I put this? It was a form of economic incentive devised in the United States Congress and Senate that was more effective than all the threats of nuclear war. It was more effective than all the grandiose speeches made about abstract principles of human rights in the United Nations. It was more effective and just said, hey, look, if you are not going to recognize in dictatorships like the Soviet Union that your people who maybe criticize your government and are unhappy with your government, that they want to leave, if you're not going to let those people leave, then on a case-by-case basis, we're going to track them, we're going to actually carry out surveillance on this issue, and we are going to hold you to account, and we're going to put an economic price on this. So there was a price tag, there was a push and pull mechanism, there was enforcement, there was mutual criticism and oversight, and it worked. Okay? It worked, and it probably did more to transform the Soviet Union than, as I say, the stockpiles of nuclear arms. And of course, it also intervened and saved the lives of significant numbers of unique individual people who, in this manner, managed to escape the Soviet Union. And of course, they also escaped the Soviet Union with their criticism and their direct experience of the Soviet Union, and were able to speak about what was wrong in that society. And then within the Soviet Union, the leaders who were not hearing that criticism from their own people, they'd hear that, they'd see that play out in the Western press. It really was a dynamite, a highly, highly effective rights enforcement mechanism. Okay, and again, this has application today. So you can imagine if you actually want to spur Saudi Arabia to transform as a culture, as a regime, you really could have a sequence of specific enforced resolutions like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that said, hey, look, Saudi Arabia, you like exporting oil. Well, you know what? We can actually have a global trade agreement that we're going to put your oil at an economic disadvantage by so many points for so many violations of one or another very simple principle, whether you call that human rights or not, okay? So human rights in the 20th century, I can't even say it rose and fell. If you're familiar just with the timeline of what happened in South Korea, the Korean War, if you're familiar with the timeline of Israel, if you're even familiar with the timeline of India after World War II, okay, the human rights doctrine was failing from the moment it was first created. And it continued failing through the whole Cold War period, and it's still a failure today. So the argument this kid, cosmic skeptic, is presenting, it's wrong both in principle and in practice. It's wrong fundamentally in principle to tell people that they should be willing to believe in an idea. They should be willing to believe in, really, this is talking about a legal regime, knowing it to be untrue, knowing it to be false, but believing it to be for the greater good of the nation. Down that path lies every evil of the Dark Ages in Europe and the Dark Ages in Asia. And we all know it's not through some kind of democratic consensual system that we agree on what will be for the greatest good of the greatest number of people. There will be oppressive, conformist notions that you must serve the interests of the leader, of the nation, of that greater good, of that greater whole. It's not up to you to choose. It's not up to you to select. This is going to be enforced on people. On the contrary, the spirit of the Enlightenment that railed against that old authoritarian attitude, and again, it's a more Machiavellian attitude, was to instead say, no, profoundly and fundamentally, it does matter if something is true or untrue. It does matter if something exists or doesn't exist, and that each individual ought to be free to inquire into, prove or disprove each principle, and to reject those principles, to say, no, I know that I owe the state nothing. The fact that I'm a citizen of this country, the fact that the government is sovereign against me, that means nothing. And I can go to court and I can prove that the government is wrong. That was the breath of fresh air that blew across Europe. And even though the French Revolution was a disaster, and even though the dictatorship of Napoleon was a disaster, and even though what was going on in British politics at that time was a disaster also, Jacobinism arose and fell across all of Europe, and most of Europe became more anti-Jacobin than anything else. Nevertheless, fundamentally, that commitment to reason, that commitment to truth for the sake of truth, and rejecting this kind of rationalization that something may be untrue but is useful and necessary for the greater good. That was the step forward we had in the Enlightenment. And people who claim to represent the highest ideals of that Enlightenment now will, in the name of those ideals, on YouTube, for a crowd of 100,000 fans, drag us all back to the Dark Ages.